Hi, everybody. I'm back. It's Christopher Palaha, and I am hosting the Palaha Chautauqua Live from the West Coast. It is 1:50 p.m. I just started a show, and I had to quit the show because no one could hear me speaking. Can you hear me speaking now? Can you hear me? Sound. I have sound. Yay! All right, we have sound. Guys, welcome to the Palaha Chautauqua. Today we're going to take a different approach to the format. Obviously, I'm not coming in with an intro song, and I'm not going to do. I have a little experiment that I want to try with you guys. My hope is that we can share some ideas, or that I can share some ideas about Black History Month with you guys. It'll be food for thought. We can always come back and talk about it next week. But I've been thinking about Black History Month, and I have been thinking about what it means to be a Christian and a human being in America. And right before the pandemic started, you will remember there was a young man who was jogging in a neighborhood, Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered by 3 white guys. He was black, but the guys were white. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happened. And the BLM movements happened, and George Floyd, and all of these events started taking place while we were all terrified of dying ourselves of this disease. And we were all sort of reduced to fear and panic and loathing, really, and all of the things that that death brings to the forefront. And every year we have Black History Month. And some people will say, why a whole month? And why not a White History Month? And people will say what they will say about Black History Month. And I've never thought much about it other than the fact that it was Black History Month. It happened to be President's Day, Valentine's Day, my birthday, my dad's birthday, my uncle's birthday. And sadly, you guys know my grandma died on the 19th. My birthday was the 18th. My Uncle John's birthday was the 19th. My dad's birthday was the 21st. And my Uncle John passed away on the 23rd. So it was just like pop, pop, pop. And so when you start looking at life through the scope of how ephemeral it is, and how temporary it is, and how fragile it is, you can't not look at the scope of humanity through everybody's perspective. Man, woman, black, white, no matter what your race, no matter what your religion, no matter what you are alive. You are a human being. And so I wanted to start a conversation with you guys, and I wanted to celebrate Black History Month. And I've been doing a lot of homework, guys. I read a book called So You Want to Talk About Race? And I can't even slaughter her name, so I'll show you the book. So You Want to Talk About Race? I read this book. It was lovely. I read James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. And I've been doing a lot of research in the Bible. And my dad said something to me the other day. He said, Dad, you should listen to the audiobook of W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. And so I started listening to it, and what I've decided to do was read to you the first 2 chapters of this book, and I'll show it to you. W.E.B. Du Bois. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to read this to you. And then I'm going to go into something else, a little bit of the Bible study. And then I'm going to go into something that my father-in-law wrote back in 1961. Now, the reason why people say, well, why Black history? Here's my theory. Here is my one sort of opinion about the matter. I'm a 45-year-old white guy from Reno, Nevada. I could tell you my stories about race, but I don't think they're particularly important because they've all been good ones. They've all been... But my experience, I wasn't in the Deep South, or I wasn't in places where there was a huge population of black folk. And so my experiences are almost inconsequential to this conversation. But one thing I do know that is if you are of European descent, you can trace your history back. You can go back and back and back and back. You could go back to the 1400s, the 1300s. You look at the royal family, they could take their lineage back all the way 1,000 years. there's a large portion of the Black Americans whose experience is very different, and they cannot take their history back because they were brought over on ships, and the farthest they can go is to know what ship their ancestors were brought over on and what port they were dropped off on. There was tons of records kept. And so when you start talking about Black history, there's an interesting thing when you take someone's history away culturally and you keep people sort of guessing where they're from, what tribe they're from, what part of Africa they're from. It does something that unsettles you on a deep level. And I believe as a Christian that racism is a spiritual bondage, and that yes, the Emancipation Proclamation happened, the Civil War happened, there was bloodshed, but I would argue that the Civil War didn't have to happen. I would argue that there could have been a way out of slavery and out of bondage and out of that evil institution without all of the bloodshed. And because there was the bloodshed, we are now stuck and trapped and snared in this spiritual bondage. And the evidence is clear. I mean, I'm not creating something. Every time you turn on the news, we have a list of names for these young people of color who were killed in the streets. Or it is a different. There's two Americas happening. And what's interesting about it was that this man wrote a book in 1903 called The Souls of Black Folk. And it is a beautiful window into Black history, but you cannot separate Black history from American history. It doesn't matter what color you are. Being an American means that the Black experience is a part of your experience. We are a part of each other's experience. So what I wanted to do was just read to you this book, because I think it's super interesting. I personally believe that you will hear things in this book that will ring true for who we are today, 119 years later. So I'm just going to go ahead and start. Bear with me. It's 33 pages. It's going to take up most of our hour here. And then it ends on a sentence that reminds me of something from the Bible I'm going to get on. So we're going to get on through. All right. So we can have discussion about this throughout the course of the year. We'll have guests on. We'll talk about it. We'll keep unpacking it. But in honor of Black History Month, I'm going to read 2 chapters of W.E.B. Du Bois' book, The Soul of Black Folks. Between me and the other world, there is an ever and unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter round it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem, they say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought at Mechanicsville, or do these southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I answer seldom a word. And yet being a problem is a strange experience, peculiar even for the one who has never been anything else, save perhaps in babyhood and in Europe. It is in the early days of rollicking boyhood that the revelation first burst upon me, all in a day, as it were. I remember well when the shadow swept across me. I was a little thing away up in the hills of New England, where the dark Houstonic winds between Hoosick and Haganek and the sea, in the wee wooden schoolhouse, something put into the boys' and girls' heads to buy gorgeous visiting cards, 10 cents a package, and exchange. The exchange was merry, till one girl, a tall newcomer, refused my card, refused it peremptorily with a glance. Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or lack mayhap in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil. Oh, to creep through. I held all beyond it in common contempt, and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows. That sky was bluest when I could beat my mates at examination time, or beat them at a foot race, or even beat their stringy heads. Alas, with the years, all this fine contempt began to fade, for the worlds I longed for, and all their dazzling opportunities were theirs, not mine. But they should not keep their prizes, I said. All, I would wrest from them. Just how I would do it, I could never decide. by reading law, by healing the sick, by telling the wonderful tales that swam in my head some way. With other black boys, the strife was not so fiercely sunny. Their youth shrunk into tasteless sycophancy, or into silent hatred of the pale world about them and mocking distrust of everything white, or wasted itself in a bitter cry, "Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in my own house?" The shades of the prison house colored round about us all, walls straight and stubborn to their widest, but relentless, narrow, tall, and unscalable to sons of night who must plod darkly on in resignation, or beat unavailing palms against the stone, or steadily, half hopelessly, watch the streak of blue above. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton, the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others and measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. It is the merging he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. This, then, is the ending of his strivings to be a co-worker in the kingdom of culture, to escape both death and isolation, to husband and use his best powers and his latent genius. These powers of body and mind have in the past been strangely wasted, dispersed, and forgotten. The shadow of a mighty Negro passed flints through the tale of Ethiopia, the shadowy, and of Egypt, the Sphinx. Throughout history, the powers of single black men flash here and there like falling stars and die sometimes before the world has rightly gauged their brightness. Here in America, in the few days since emancipation, the black man's turning hither and thither in hesitant and doubtful striving has often made his very strength to lose effectiveness, to seem like absence of power, like weakness. And yet it is not weakness, it is the contradiction of double aims. The double-aimed struggle of the black artisan, on one hand to escape white contempt for a nation of mere hewers of wood and drawers of water, and on the other hand to plow and nail and dig for a poverty-stricken horde, could only result in making him a poor craftsman, for he had but half a heart to either cause. By the poverty and the ignorance of his people, the black minister or doctor was tempted towards quackery and demagogy, by the criticism of the other world towards ideas that made him ashamed of his lowly tasks. The would-be black savant was confronted by the paradox that the knowledge of his people needed was a twice-told tale to his white neighbors, while the knowledge which would teach the white world was Greek to his own flesh and blood. The innate love of harmony and beauty that set the rudder souls of his people a-dancing and singing raised but confusion and doubt in the souls of the black artist. For the beauty revealed to him was the soul beauty of a race which his larger audience despised, and he could not articulate the message of another people. This waste of double aims, this seeking to satisfy two unreconciled ideas, has wrought sad havoc with the courage and faith and deeds of 10,000 people, has sent them often wooing false gods and invoking false meaning of salvation, and at times has even seemed about to make them ashamed of themselves. Away back in the days of bondage, they thought to see in one divine event the dull end of all doubt and disappointment. Few men ever worshipped freedom with half such unquestioning faith as did the American black man and woman for 2 centuries. To him, so far he thought and dreamed, slavery was indeed the sum of all villainies, the cause of all sorrow, the root of all prejudice. Emancipation was the key to a promised land of sweeter beauty than ever stretched before the eyes of wearied Israelites. In song and exhortation swelled one refrain, liberty, and his tears and curses the God he implored had freedom in his right hand. At last it came, suddenly, fearfully, like a dream. With one wild carnival of blood and passion came the message in his own plaintive cadences. Shout, O children, shout, you're free, for God has brought your liberty. Years have passed away since then, 10, 20, 40 years of national life, 40 years of renewal and development. And yet the swarthy specter sits in the accustomed seat of the nation's feast. In vain do we cry to our vastest social problem, take any shape at that. Any firm nerves shall never tremble. The nation has not yet found peace for its sins. The freed man has not yet found in freedom his promised land. Whatever of good may have come in these years of change, the shadow of a deep disappointment rests upon the Negro people. A disappointment all the more bitter because the unattained idea was unbound save by the simple ignorance of a lowly people. The first decade was merely a prolongation of the vain search for freedom, the boon that seemed ever barely to elude their grasp, like a tantalizing will o' the wisps. Hang on 1 second. Hang on 1 second. Okay. Sorry. Maddening and misleading, the headless host, the holocaust of war, the terrors of the Ku Klux Klan, the lies of carpetbaggers, the disorganization of industry, and the contradictory advice of friends and foes left the bewildered serf with no new watchword beyond the old cry for freedom. As the time flew, however, he began to grasp a new idea. The idea of liberty demanded for his attainment powerful means, and these the Fifth Amendment gave him, the ballot, which before he had looked upon as a visible sign of freedom, he now regarded as the chief means of gaining and perfecting the liberty with which war had partially endowed him. And why not? Had not votes made war and emancipated millions? Had not votes enfranchised the freedmen? Was anything impossible to a power that had done all this? 1 million black men started with renewed zeal to vote themselves into the kingdom. So the decade flew away. The revolution of 1876 came and left the half-free serf weary, wandering, but still inspired. Slowly but steadily in the following years, a new vision began gradually to replace the dream of political power. A powerful movement, the rise of another idea to guide the unguided, another pillar of fire by night after a clouded day. It was the idea of book learning, the curiosity born of compulsory ignorance, to know and to test the power of the Kabbalistic letters of the white man, the longing to know. Here at last seemed to have been discovered the mountain path to Canaan, longer than the highway of emancipation and law, steep and rugged but straight, leading to heights high enough to overlook life. Up the new path the advance guard toiled, slowly, heavily, doggedly. Only those who have watched and guided the faltering feet, the misty minds, the dull understandings of the dark pupils of these schools know how faithfully, how piteously this people strove to learn. This was weary work. The cold statisticians wrote down the inches of progress here and there, noted also where and here, there, a foot had slipped or someone had fallen. The tired climbers, the horizon was ever dark. The mists were often cold. The Canaan was always dim and far away. If, however, the vistas disclosed as yet no goal, no resting place, little but flattering criticism, the journey at last gave leisure for reflection and self-examination. It changed the child of emancipation to the youth with dawning self-consciousness, self-realization, self-respect. And those somber forests of his striving, his own soul rose before him, and he saw himself darkly as through a veil. And yet he saw in himself some faint revelation of his power, of his mission. he would begin to have a dim feeling that to attain his place in the world, he must be himself and not another. For the first time, he sought to analyze the burden he bore upon his back, the dead weight of social degradation partially masked behind the half-named Negro problem. He felt his poverty without a cent, without a home, without land, tools, or savings. He had entered into competition with rich, landed, skilled neighbors. To be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships. He felt the weight of his ignorance, not simply of letters, but of life, of business, of the humanities, the accumulated sloth and shirking and awkwardness of decades and centuries shackled in hands and feet. It shackled his hands and feet. Nor was his burden all poverty and ignorance. The red stain of bastardy, which 2 centuries of systematic legal defilement of Negro women had stamped upon his race, meant not only the loss of ancient African chastity, but also the hereditary weight of a massive corruption from white adulterers, threatening almost the obliteration of the Negro home. A people thus handicapped ought not to be asked to race with the world, but rather allowed to give all its time and thought to its own social problems. But alas, while sociologists gleefully count his bastards and his prostitutes, the very soul of the toiling, sweating black man is darkened by the shadow of a vast despair. Men call the shadow prejudice and learnedly explain it as a natural defense of culture against barbarism, learning against ignorance, purity against crime, the higher against the lower races, to which the Negro cries amen and swears that to so much of this strange prejudice as is founded on just homage to civilization, culture, righteousness, and progress, he humbly bows and meekly does obedience. But before that nameless prejudice that leaps beyond all this, he stands helpless, dismayed, and well nigh speechless before that personal disrespect and mockery, that ridicule and systematic humiliation, this distortion of fact and wanton license of fancy, the cynical ignoring of the better and the boisterous welcoming of the worse, the all-pervading desire to inculcate disdain for everything black, from Toussaint to the devil. Before this, there rises a sickening despair that would disarm and discourage any nation save the black host to whom discouragement is an unwritten word. But the facing of so vast a prejudice could not but bring the inevitable self-questioning, self-disparagement, and lowering of ideas which ever accompany repression and breed in an atmosphere of contempt and hate. Whisperings and portents came borne upon the 4 winds. Lo, we are diseased and dying, cried the dark hosts. We cannot write. Our voting is vain. What of education, since we must always cook and serve? And the nation echoed and enforced this self-criticism, saying, be content to be servants and nothing more. What need of higher culture for half men? Away with the black man's ballot by force or fraud, and behold the suicide of a race. Nevertheless, out of the evil came something of good. The more careful adjustment of education to real life, the clearer perception of the Negro's social responsibilities, and the sobering realization of the meaning of progress. So dawned the time of Strum and und Drang. Storm and stress today rocks our little boat, and the mad waters of the world sea. There is within and without the sound of conflict, the burning of body, the rending of soul. Inspiration strives without doubt, and fraud with vain questionings. The bright ideas of the past, physical freedom, political power, the training of brains and the training of hands, all these in turn have waxed and waned until even the last grows dim and overcast. Are they all wrong, all false? No, not that, but each alone was oversimple and incomplete. The dreams of a credulous race childhood, of the fond imaginings of another world which does not know and does not want to know our power. To be really true, all these ideas must be melted and welded into one. The training of the schools we need today more than ever, the training of deft hands, quick eyes and ears, and above all, the broader, deeper, higher culture of gifted minds and pure hearts. The power of the ballot we need in sheer self-defense. Else what shall save us from second slavery? Freedom, too, the long sought we still seek, the freedom of life and limb, the freedom to work and think, the freedom to love and aspire, work, culture, liberty. All these we need, not singly but together, not successively but together, each growing and aiding each, and all striving towards that vaster idea that swims before the Negro people, the idea of human brotherhood gained through the unifying idea of race. The idea of fostering and developing the traits and talents of the Negro, not in opposition to or contempt for other races, but rather in large conformity to the greater ideas of the American Republic, in order that someday on American soil 2 world races may give each other, to each those characteristics both so sadly lack. We the darker ones can come even now, not altogether empty-handed. There are today no truer exponents of the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than the American Negroes. There is no true American music but the wild, sweet melodies of the Negro slave. The American fairy tales and folklore are Indian and African, and all in all, we black men seem the sole oasis of simple faith and reverence in a dusty desert of dollars and smartness. Will America be poorer if she replace her brutal, dyspeptic blundering with light-hearted but determined Negro humility? Or her coarse and cruel wit with loving, jovial good humor? Or her vulgar music with the soul of sorrow songs? Merely a concrete test of the underlying principles of the great republic is the Negro problem, is the spiritual striving of the freedom's souls, of the freedmen's sons, and the travail of souls whose burden is almost beyond the measure of their strength, but who bear it in the name of a historic race, in the name of this, the land of their fathers' fathers, in the name of human opportunity. And now, what I have briefly sketched in large outline, let me on coming pages tell again in many ways, with loving emphasis and deeper detail, that men may listen to the strivings and the souls of black folk. All right, we are moving into chapter 2 of the dawn of freedom. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. It was a phase of this problem that caused the Civil War, and however much they who marched south and north in 1861 may have fixed on the technical points of union and local autonomy as a shibboleth, all nevertheless knew, as we know, that the question of Negro slavery was the real cause of the conflict. Curious it was, too, how this deeper question ever forced itself to the surface despite effort and disclaimer. No sooner had Northern armies touched Southern soil than this old question, newly guised, sprang from the earth. What shall we be done with the blacks? Peremptory military commands, this way and that, could not answer the query. The Emancipation Proclamation seemed but to broaden and intensify the difficulties, and the war amendments made the Negro problem of today. It is the aim of this essay to study the period of history from 1861 to 1872, so far as it relates to the American Negro. In effect, this tale is the dawn of freedom in an account of that government of men called the Freedmen's Bureau, one of the most singular and interesting of attempts made by a great nation to grapple with vast problems of race and social condition. The war has not to do with slaves, cried Congress, the president, and the nation, and yet no sooner had the armies east and west penetrated Virginia and Tennessee than fugitive slaves appeared within their lines. They came at night. The flickering campfires shone like vast, unsteady stars along the black horizon. Old men and thin, with gray and tufted hair, women with frightened eyes, dragging, whimpering, hungry children, men and girls, stalwart and gaunt, a horde of starving vagabonds, homeless, helpless, and pitiable in their dark distress. Two methods of treating these newcomers seemed equally logical to opposite sorts of minds. Ben Butler in Virginia quickly declared slave property contraband of war and put the fugitives to work, while Fremont in Missouri declared the slaves free under martial law. Butler's action was approved, but Fremont's was hastily countermanded, and his successor, Halleck, saw things differently. Hereafter, he commanded, no slave should be allowed to come into your lines at all. If any come without your knowledge, when owners call for them, deliver them. Such a policy was difficult to enforce. Some of the black refugees declared themselves freedmen. Others showed that their masters had deserted them, and still others were captured with forts and plantations. Evidently, too, slaves were a source of strength to the Confederacy and were being used as laborers and producers. They constitute a military resource, wrote Secretary Cameron late in 1861, and being such, they should not be turned over to the enemy is too plain to discuss. So gradually the tone of the army chiefs changed. Congress forbade the rendition of fugitives, and Butler's contrabands were welcome as military laborers. This complicated rather than solved the problem, for now the scattering fugitives became a steady stream, which flowered faster as the armies marched. Then the long-headed man with care-chiseled face who sat in the White House saw the inevitable and emancipated the slaves of rebels on New Year's, 1863. A month later, Congress called earnestly for the Negro soldiers whom the Act of July 1862 had half-grudgingly allowed to enlist. Thus the barriers were levied and the deed was done. The stream of fugitives swelled to a flood, and anxious army officers kept inquiring what must be done with slaves arriving almost daily. Are we to find food and shelter for women and children? It was a Pierce of Boston who pointed out the way, and thus became the founder of the Freedmen's Bureau. He was a firm friend of Secretary Chase, and when, in 1861, the care of slaves and abandoned lands devolved upon the Treasury officials, Pierce was specifically detailed from the ranks to study the conditions. First, he cared for the refugees at Fortress Monroe, and then, after Sherman had captured Hilton Head, Pierce was sent there to found his Port Royal experiment of making free working men out of slaves. Before his experiment was barely started, however, the problem of the fugitives had assumed such proportions that it was taken from the hands of the overburdened Treasury Department and given to the Army officials. Already centers of massed freedmen were forming in Fortress Monroe, Washington, New Orleans, Vicksburg, and Corinth, Columbus, Kentucky, and Cairo, Illinois, as well as Port Royal. Army captains found here new and faithful fields. Superintendents of contrabands multiplied, and some attempt of systematic work was made by enlisting the able-bodied men and giving work to the others. Then came Freedmen's Aid Societies, born of the touching appeals from Pierce and from other centers of distress. There was the American Missionary Association, sprung from the Amistad, and now full grown for work, the various church organizations, the National Freedmen's Relief Association, the American Freedmen's Union, the Western Freedmen's Aid Commission, in all 50 or more active organizations which sent clothes, money, school books, and teachers southward. All they did was needed for the destitution of the freedmen was often reported as too appalling for belief, and the situation was daily growing worse rather than better. And daily, too, it seemed more plain than this. It was no ordinary matter of temporary relief, but a national crisis, for here loomed a labor problem of vast dimensions. Masses of Negroes stood idle, or if they worked spasmodically, were never sure of pay, and if perchance they received pay, squandered the new thing thoughtlessly. And these and other ways were camp life and the new liberty demoralizing the freedmen. The broader economic organization thus clearly demanded sprang up here and there as accident and local conditions determined. Here it was that Pierce Port Royal Plain of leased plantations and guided workmen pointed out the rough way. In Washington, the military governor, at the urgent appeal of the superintendent, opened confiscated estates to the cultivation of the fugitives, and there, in the shadow of the dome, gathered black farm villages. General Dix gave over estates to the freedmen of Fortress Monroe, and so on, south and west. The government and benevolent societies furnished the means of cultivation, and the Negro turned again slowly to work. The systems of control thus started, rapidly grew, here and there, into strange little governments, like that of General Banks in Louisiana, with its 90,000 black subjects, its 50,000 guided laborers, and its annual budget of $100,000 and more. It made out 4,000 payrolls a year, registered all freedmen, inquired into grievances and redressed them, laid and collected taxes, and established a system of public schools. So, too, Colonel Eaton, superintendent of Tennessee and Arkansas, ruled over 100,000 freedmen, leased and cultivated 7,000 acres of cotton land, and fed 10,000 paupers a year. In South Carolina was General Saxton with his deep interest in black folk. He succeeded Pierce and the Treasury officials and sold fortified estates, leased abandoned plantations, encouraged schools, and received from Sherman, after that terribly picturesque march to the sea, thousands of the wretched camp followers. Three characteristic things one might have seen in Sherman's raid through Georgia, which threw the new situation in shadowy relief: the conqueror, the conquered, and the Negro. Some see all significance in the grime front of the destroyer, and some in the bitter sufferers of the lost cause. But to me, neither soldier nor fugitive speaks with so deep a meaning as that dark human cloud that clung like remorse on the rear of those swift columns, swelling at times to half their size, almost engulfing and choking them. In vain were they ordered back, in vain were bridges hewn from beneath their feet. On the trudged and writhed and surged until they rolled into Savannah and starved a naked horde of tens of thousands. There too came characteristic military remedy. The island from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. John River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of Negroes now made free by act of war. So read the celebrated Field Order Number 15. All these experiments, orders, and systems were bound to attract and perplex the government and the nation. Directly after Emancipation Proclamation, Representative Elliott had introduced a bill creating a Bureau of Emancipation, but it was never reported. The following June, a committee of inquiry appointed by the Secretary of War reported in favor of temporary Bureau for the Improvement Protection, and Employment of Refugee Freedmen. And on the same lines as were afterwards followed, petitions came into the President Lincoln from distinguished citizens and organizations strongly urging a comprehensive and unified plan of dealing with the freedmen under a bureau which should be charged with the study and of plans and execution of measures for easily guiding and in every way judiciously and humanely aiding the passage of our emancipated and yet to be emancipated black folks from the old condition of forced labor to the new state of voluntary industry. Some half-hearted steps were taken to accomplish this, in part by putting the whole matter again in charge of the special treasury agents. Laws of 1863 and 1864 directed them to take charge of and lease abandoned lands for periods not exceeding 12 months, and to provide in such lease or otherwise for the employment of general welfare of the freedmen. Most of the Army officers greeted this as a welcome relief from perplexing Negro affairs, and Secretary Fessenden, July 29, 1864, issued an excellent system of regulations, which were afterwards closely followed by General Howard. Under Treasury agents, large quantities of land were leased in the Mississippi Valley, and many Negroes were employed. But in August 1864, the new regulations were suspended for reasons of public policy, and the Army was again in control. Meanwhile, Congress had turned its attention to the subject, and in March, the House passed a bill by a majority of 2 establishing a Bureau for Freedmen in the War Department. Charles Sumner, who had charge of the bill in the Senate, argued that freedmen and abandoned lands ought to be under the same department and reported a substitute for the House bill attaching the Bureau of the Treasury Department. This bill passed, but too late for action by the House. The debates wandered over the whole policy of the administration and the general question of slavery without touching very closely the specific merits of the measure in hand. Then the national election took place, and the administration, with a voted renewed confidence from the county, added itself to the matter more seriously. A conference between the 2 branches of Congress agreed upon a carefully drawn measure which contained the chief provisions of Sumner's bill, but made the proposed organization a department independent of both the War and the Treasury officials. The bill was conservative, giving the new department general superintendence of all freedmen. Its purpose was to establish regulations for them, protect them, lease the lands, adjust their wages, and appeal in civil and military courts as their next friend. There were many limitations attached to the powers thus granted, and the organization was made permanent. Nevertheless, the Senate defeated the bill, and a new conference committee was appointed. This committee reported a new bill, February 28th, which was whirlwind through just as the session closed and became the Act of 1865, establishing the War Department, a Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. This last compromise was a hasty bit of legislation, vague and uncertain in outline. A bureau was created to continue during the present War of Rebellion, and for 1 year thereafter, to which was given the supervision and management of all abandoned lands and the control of all subjects related to refugees and freedmen under such rules and regulations as may be presented by the head of the bureau, approved by the President. A commissioner appointed by the President and Senate was to control the bureau, with an office force not exceeding 10 clerks. The President might also appoint assistant commissioners in the second states, and to all these offices military officials might be detailed at regular pay. The Secretary of War could issue rations, clothing, and fuel to the destitute, and all abandoned property was placed in the hands of the Bureau for eventual lease and sale to ex-slaves in 40-acre parcels. Thus did the United States government definitively assume charge of the emancipated Negro as a ward of the nation. It was a tremendous undertaking. Here, at a stroke of the pen, was erected a government of millions of men, and not ordinary men either, but black men emasculated by a peculiar, complete system of slavery centuries old, and now suddenly, violently, they come into a new birthright at a time of war and passion in the midst of the stricken and embittered population of their former masters. Any man might well have hesitated to assume charge of such a work, with vast responsibilities, indefinite powers, and limited resources. Probably no one but a soldier would have answered such a call promptly, and indeed no one but a soldier could be called, for Congress had appropriated no money for salaries or expenses. Less than half a month after the weary emancipator passed to his rest, his successor assigned Major General Oliver O. Howard to duty as commissioner of the new bureau. He was a Maine man, then only 35 years of age. He had marched with Sherman to the sea, had fought well at Gettysburg, but the year before had been assigned to the command of the Department of Tennessee. An honest man with too much faith in human nature, little aptitude for business and intricate detail, he had had large opportunity of becoming acquainted firsthand with much of the work before him. And of that work, it has been truly said that no approximately correct history of civilization can ever be written which does not throw out in bold relief, as one of the great landmarks of political and social progress, the organization and administration of the Freedmen's Bureau. On May 12, 1865, Howard was appointed, and he assumed the duties of his office promptly on the 15th, and began examining the field of work. A curious mess he looked upon: little despotisms, communistic experiments, slavery, peonage, business speculations, organized charity, unorganized almsgivings, all reeling on under the guise of helping the freedmen, and all enshrined in the smoke and blood of war and the cursing and silence of angry men. On May 19th, the new government, for a government it really was, issued its constitution. Commissioners were to be appointed in each of the second states, who were to take charge of all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen, and all relief and rations were to be given by their consent alone. This bureau invited continued cooperation with benevolent societies and declared it will be the object of all commissioners to introduce practicable systems of compensated labor and to establish schools. Forthwith, 9 assistant commissions were appointed. They were to hasten to their fields of work, seek gradually to close relief establishments, and make the destitute self-supporting. Acts as courts of law where there were no courts, or where Negroes were not recognized in them as free. Establish the institution of marriage among ex-slaves, and keep records. See that freedmen were free to choose their employers, and help in making fair contracts for them. And finally, the circular said, simple good faith, for which we hope on all hands, for those concerned in the passing away of slavery, will especially relieve the assistant commissioners in the discharge of their duties toward the freemen, as well as promote the general welfare. No sooner was the work thus started and the general system of local organization in some measure begun than 2 grave difficulties appeared which changed largely the theory and outcome of bureau work. First, there were the abandoned lands of the South. It had long been the more or less definitely expressed theory of the North that all the chief problems of emancipation might be settled by establishing the slaves on the fortified lands of their masters, a sort of poetic justice, said some. But this poetry done into solemn prose meant either wholesale confiscation of private property in the South or vast appropriations. Now Congress had not appropriated a cent, and no sooner did the proclamations of general amnesty appear than the 800,000 acres of abandoned lands in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau melted quickly away. The second difficulty lay in perfecting the local organization of the Bureau throughout the wide field of work, making a new mechanic and sending out officials of duly ascertained fitness for a great work of social reform is no child's task. But this task was even harder, for new central organization had to be fitted in a heterogeneous and confused but already existing system of relief and control of ex-slaves, and the agents available for this work must be sought for in an army but still busy with war operations, men in the very nature of the case ill-fitted for delicate social work, or among the questionable camp followers of an invading host. Thus, after a year's work vigorously as it was pursued, the problem looked even more difficult to grasp and solve than the beginning. Nevertheless, 3 things that year's work did, well worth the doing. It relieved a vast amount of physical suffering. It transported 7,000 fugitives from congested centers back to the farm. And best of all, it inaugurated the crusade of the New England schoolma'am. The annals of this 9th crusade are yet to be written, the tale of a mission that seemed to our age far more quixotic than the quest of St. Louis seemed to his. Behind the mists of ruin and rapine waved the calico dresses of women who dared, and after the hoarse mouthings of the field guns rang the rhythm of the alphabet. Rich and poor they were, serious and curious. Bereaved now of a father, now of a brother, now more than these, they came seeking a life work in planting New England schoolhouses among the white and black of the South. They did their work well. In that first year, they taught 100,000 souls and more. Evidently, Congress must soon legislate again on the hastily organized Bureau, which had so quickly grown into wide significance and vast possibilities. An institution such as that was well nigh as difficult to end as to begin. Early in 1866, Congress took up the matter when Senator Chubnell of Illinois introduced a bill to extend the Bureau and enlarge its powers. This measure received at the hands of Congress far more thorough discussion and attention than its predecessor. The war cloud had thinned enough to allow a clear conception of the work of emancipation. The champions of the bill argued that the strengthening of the Freedmen's Bureau was still a military necessity, that it was needed for the proper carrying of the 13th Amendment, and was a work of sheer justice of ex-slave at a trifling cost to the government. The opponents of the measure declared that the war was over and the necessity of war measures past, that the Bureau, by reason of extraordinary powers, was clearly unconstitutional in time of peace, and was destined to irritate the South and pauperize the freedmen at a final cost of possibly hundreds of millions. These 2 arguments were unanswered, and indeed unanswerable. The one, that the extraordinary powers of the Bureau threatened the civil rights of all citizens, and the other, that the government must have power to do what manifestly must be done, and that present abandonment of the freedmen meant their practical re-enslavement. The bill, which finally passed, enlarged and made permanent the Freedmen's Bureau. It was promptly vetoed by President Johnson as unconstitutional, unnecessary, and extrajudicial, and failed of passage over the veto. Meantime, however, the breach between Congress and the President began to broaden, and a modified form of the lost bill was finally passed over the President's second veto, July 16th. The Act of 1866 gave the Freedmen's Bureau its final form, the form by which it will be known to posterity and judged of men. It extended the existence of the Bureau to July 1868. It authorized additional assistant commissioners, the retention of army officers mustered out of regular service, the sale of certain fortified lands to freedmen on nominal terms, the sale of Confederate public property for Negro schools, and a wider field of judicial interpretation and cognizance. The government of the unreconstructed South was thus put very largely in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau, especially as in many cases the departmental military commander was now made also assistant commissioner. It was thus that the Freedmen's Bureau became a full-fledged government of men. It made laws, executed them, and interpreted them. It laid and collected taxes, defined and punished crime, maintained and used military force, and dictated such measures as it thought necessary and proper for the accomplishment of its varied ends. Naturally, all these powers were not exercised continuously, nor to their fullest extent, and yet, as General Howard has said, scarcely any subject that has to be legislated upon in civil society failed, at one time or another, to demand the action of this singular bureau. To understand and criticize intelligently so vast a work, one must not forget an instant the drift of things in the later 60s. Lee had surrendered, Lincoln was dead, and Johnson and Congress were at loggerheads. The 13th Amendment was adopted, the 14th pending, and the 15th declared in force in 1870. Guerrilla raiding, the ever-present flickering afterflame of war, was spending its force against the Negroes, and all the southern land was awakening as from some wild dream to poverty and social revolution. In a time of perfect calm, amid willing neighbors and streaming wealth, the social uplifting of 4 million slaves to an assured and self-sustaining place in the body politic and economic would have been a Herculean task. But when to the inherent difficulties of so delicate and nice a social operation were added the spite and hate of conflict, the hell of war, when suspicion and cruelty were rife and gaunt hunger wept beside bereavement, in such a case the work of any instrument of social regeneration was in large part foredoomed to failure. The very name of the Bureau stood for a thing in the South which for 2 centuries and better men had refused even to argue, that life amid free Negroes was simply unthinkable, the maddest of experiments. The agents of the Bureau could command varied all the way from unselfish philanthropists to narrow-minded busybodies and thieves, and even though it be true to the average was far better than the worst, it was the occasional fly that helped spoil the ointment. Then amid all crouched the freed slave, bewildered between friend and foe. He had emerged from slavery, not the worst slavery in the world, not a slavery that made all life unbearable, rather a slavery that had here and there something of kindness, fidelity, and happiness, but withal slavery, which, so far as human aspiration and desert were concerned, classed the black man and the ox together. And the Negro knew full well that whatever their deeper convictions may have been, Southern men had fought with desperate energy to perpetuate this slavery under which the black masses, with half-articulate thought, had writhed and shivered. They welcomed freedom with a cry. They shrank from the master who still strove from their chains. They fled to the friends that had freed them, even though those friends stood ready to use them as a club for driving the recalcitrant South back into loyalty. So they cleft between the white and black South grew. Idle to say it never should have been. It was as inevitable as its results were pitiable. Curiously incongruous elements were left arrayed against each other. The North, the government, the carpetbagger, the slave, here and there. All the South that was white, whether gentleman or vagabond, honest or rascal, lawless murderer or martyr to duty. Thus it is doubly difficult to write of this period calmly. So intense was the feeling, so mighty the human passions that swayed and blinded men. Amid it all, 2 figures ever stand to typify the day to coming ages. The one, a gray-haired gentleman, whose fathers had quite themselves like men, whose sons lay in nameless graves, who bowed to the evil of slavery because its abolition threatened untold ill to all, who stood at last, in the evening of life, a blighted, ruined form, with hate in his eyes, and the other, a form hovering dark and mother-like, her awful face black with the mists of centuries, had aforetime qualified of that white master's command, had bent in love over the cradles of his sons and daughters, and closed in death the sunken eyes of his wife. I, too, at his behest, had laid herself low to his lust, and borne a tawny man-child to the world, only to see her dark boy's limbs scattered to the winds by midnight marauders riding after cursed. There were the saddest sights of that woeful day, and no man clasped the hands of these 2 passing figures of the past present, but hating they went to their long home, and hating their children's children live today. Here, then, was the field work of the Freedmen's Bureau, and since, with some hesitation, it was continued by the Act of 1868 until 1869. Let us look upon 4 years of its work as a whole. There were in 1868 900 Bureau officials scattered from Washington to Texas, ruling directly and indirectly many millions of men. The deeds of these rulers fall mainly under 7 heads: the relief of physical suffering, the overseeing of the beginnings of free labor, the buying and selling of land, the establishment of schools, the paying of bounties, the administration of justice, and the financiering of all of these activities. Up to June 1869, over 500,000 patients had been treated by Bureau physicians and surgeons, and 60 hospitals and asylums had been in operation. In 50 months, 21 million free rations were distributed at the cost of over $4 million. Next came the difficult question of labor. First, 30,000 black men were transported from the refugees and relief stations back to the farms, back to the critical trial of a new way of working. Plain instructions went out from Washington. The laborers must be free to choose their employers. No fixed rates of wages was prescribed, and there was to be no peonage or forced labor. So far, so good. But where local agents differed toto coelho in capacity and character, where the personnel was continually changing, the outcome was necessarily varied. The largest element of success lay in the fact that the majority of the freedmen were willing, even eager to work. So labor contracts were written, 50,000 in a single state. Laborers advised, wages guaranteed, and employers supplied. In truth, the organization became a vast labor bureau. Not perfect, indeed, notably defective here and there, but on the whole, successful beyond the dreams of thoughtful men. The two great obstacles which confronted the officials were the tyrant and the idler, the slaveholder who was determined to perpetuate slavery under another name, and the freedman who regarded freedom as perpetual rest, the devil and the deep sea. In the work of establishing the Negroes as peasants, proprietors, the Bureau was from the first handicapped and at last absolutely checked. Something was done, and larger things were planned. Abandoned lands were leased so long as they remained in the hands of the Bureau, and a total revenue of nearly $500,000 derived from black tenants. Some other lands to which the nation had gained title were sold on easy terms, and public lands were opened for settlements to the very few freedmen who had tools and who had tools and capital. But the vision of 40 acres and a mule, the righteous and reasonable ambition to become a landholder, which the nation had all but categorically promised the freedmen, was destined in most cases to bitter disappointment. And those men of marvelous hindsight who are today seeking to preach the Negro back to the present peonage of the soil known well, or ought to know, that the opportunity of binding the Negro peasant willingly to the soil was lost on that day when the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau had to go to South Carolina and tell the weeping freedmen, after their years of toil, that their land was not theirs, that there was a mistake somewhere. If by 1874 the Georgia Negro alone owned 350,000 acres of land, it was by grace of his thrift rather than by bounty of the government. The greatest successes of the Freedmen's Bureau lay in the planting of the free school among Negroes and the idea of free elementary education among all classes in the South. It not only called the schoolmistresses through the benevolent agencies and built them schoolhouses, but it helped discover and support such apostles of human culture as Edmund Ware, Samuel Armstrong, and Erastus Cravath. The opposition to Negro education in the South was bitter at first and showed itself in ashes, insult, and blood. But the South believed an educated Negro to be a dangerous Negro, and the South was not wholly wrong. For education among all kinds of men always has had and always will have an element of danger and revolution, of dissatisfaction and discontent. Nevertheless, men strive to know. Perhaps some inkling of this paradox, even in the uniquer days of the Bureau, helped the bayonets allay the opposition to human training which still today lies smoldering in the South, but not flaming. Fisk, Atlanta, Howard, and Hampton were founded in these days, and $6 million were expended for educational work, $750,000 of which the freedmen themselves gave of their property. Such contributions, together with the buying of land and the various other enterprises, showed that the ex-slave was handling some free capital already. The chief initial source of this was labor in the army, and his pay and bounty as a soldier. Payments to Negro soldiers were at first complicated by the ignorance of the recipients and the fact that the quotas of colored regiments from northern states was largely filled by recruits from the South, unknown to their fellow soldiers. Consequently, payments were accompanied by such frauds that Congress, by joint resolution in 1867, put the whole matter in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau. In 2 years, $6 million was thus distributed to 5,000 claimants, and in the end, the sum exceeded $8 million. Even in this system, fraud was frequent, but still the work put needed capital in the hands of practical paupers, and some, at least, was well spent. The most perplexing and least successful part of the Bureau's work lay in the exercise of its judicial functions. The regular Bureau court consisted of one representative of the employer, one of the Negro, and one of the Bureau. If the Bureau could have maintained a perfectly judicial attitude, this arrangement would have been ideal and must in time have gained confidence, but the nature of its other activities and the character of its personnel prejudiced the Bureau in favor of the black litigants and led without doubt to much injustice and annoyance. On the other hand, to leave the Negro in the hands of Southern courts was impossible. In a distracted land where slavery had hardly fallen, to keep the strong from wanton abuse of the weak and the weak from gloating insolently over the half-shorn strength of the strong was a thankless, hopeless task. The former masters of the land were peremptorily ordered about, seized and imprisoned and punished over and again with scant courtesy from army officers. The former slaves were intimidated, beaten, raped, and butchered by angry and revengeful men. Bureau courts tended to become centers simply for punishing whites, while the regular civil courts tended to become solely institutions for perpetuating the slavery of blacks. Almost every law and method ingenuity could devise was employed by the legislatures to reduce the Negroes to serfdom, to make them the slaves of the state, if not of individual owners, while the Bureau officials too often were found striving to put the bottom rail on top and give the freedom a power and independence, and to give the freedmen a power and independence which they could not use yet. It is all well enough for us of other generations to wax wise with advice to those who bore the burden in the heat of the day. It is full easy now to see that the man who lost home, fortune, and family at a stroke and saw his land ruled by mules and blacks was really benefited by the passing of slavery. It is not difficult now to say that the young freedman, cheated and cuffed about, who has seen his father's head beaten to a jelly and his own mother namelessly assaulted, that the meek shall inherit the earth. Above all, nothing is more convenient than to heap on the Freedmen's Bureau all the evils of that evil day and damn it utterly for every mistake and blunder that was made. All this is easy, but it is neither sensible nor just. Someone had blundered, but that was long before Oliver Howard was born, and there was criminal aggression and heedless neglect, but without some system of control there would have been far more than there was. Had that control been from within, the Negro would have been re-enslaved to all intents and purposes. Commanding as the control did from without, perfect men and methods would have bettered all things, and even with imperfect agents and questionable methods, the work accomplished was not undeserving of commendation. Such was the dawn of freedom. Such was the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, which, summed up in brief, may be epitomized thus. For some $15 million, besides the sum spent before 1865 and the dole of benevolent societies, this Bureau set going a system of free labor, established a beginning of peasant proprietorship, secured the recognition of black freedmen before courts of law, and founded the Free Common School in the South. On the other hand, it failed to begin the establishment of goodwill between ex-masters and freedmen, to guard its work wholly from paternalistic methods which discouraged self-reliance, and to carry out any considerable extent it implies promises to furnish the freedmen with land. Its successes were the result of hard work supplemented by the aid of philanthropists and its eager striving of black men. Its failures were the result of bad local agents, the inherent difficulties of the work, and national neglect. Such an institution, from its wide power, great responsibilities, large control of monies, and generally conspicuous position, was naturally open to repeated and bitter attack. It sustained a searching congressional investigation at the instance of Fernando Wood in 1870. Its archives and few remaining functions were with blunt discourtesy transferred from Howard's control in his absence to the supervision of Secretary of War Belknap in 1872 on the Secretary's recommendation. Finally, in consequence of grave intimations of wrongdoing made by the Secretary and his subordinates, General Howard was court-martialed in 1874. In both of these trials, the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau was officially exonerated from any willful misdoing and his work commended. Nevertheless, many unpleasant things were brought to light. The The methods of transacting business of the Bureau were faulty. Several cases of defalcation were proved, and other frauds strongly suspected. There were some business transactions which savored on dangerous speculation, if not dishonesty, and around it all lay the smirch of the Freedmen's Bank. Morally and practically, this is where it gets good. We're almost, we're one page off. Morally and practically, the Freedmen's Bank was part of the Freedmen's Bureau. Although it had no legal connection with it, with the prestige of the government bank, the government back of it, and the directing board of unusual respectability and national reputation, this banking institution had made a remarkable start in the development of that thrift among black folk which slavery had kept them from knowing. Then in one sad day came the crash. All the hard-earned dollars of the freedmen disappeared. But that was the least of the loss. All of the faith in saving went too, and much of the faith in men. And that was a loss that a nation which today sneers at Negro shiftlessness has never yet made good. Not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done so much to throttle the thrift of the freedmen as the mismanagement and bankruptcy of the series of savings banks chartered by the nation for their special aid. Where all the blame should rest, it is hard to say, whether the Bureau and the bank died chiefly by reason of the blows of its selfish friends or the dark machinations of its foes. Perhaps even time will never reveal. For here lies unwritten history. Of the foes without the Bureau, the bitterest were those who attacked not so much its conduct or policy under the law as the necessity for any such institution at all. Such attacks came primarily from the border states and the South, and they were summed up by Senator Davis of Kentucky when he moved to entitle the Act of 1866 a bill to promote strife and conflict between the white and black races by a grant of unconstitutional power. The argument gathered tremendous strength south and north, but its very strength was its weakness. For, argued the plain common sense of the nation, if it is unconstitutional, unpractical, and futile for the nation to stand guardian over its helpless wards, then there is left but one alternative: to make those wards their own guardians by arming them with the ballot. Moreover, the path of the practical politician pointed the same way, for, argued this opportunist, if we cannot peacefully reconstruct the South with white votes, we certainly can with black votes. So justice and force joined hands. The alternative thus offered the nation was not between full and restricted Negro suffrage, but every sensible man, black and white, would easily have chosen the latter. It was rather a choice between suffrage and slavery. After endless blood and gold had flowed to sweep human bondage away, not a single Southern legislator stood ready to admit a Negro under any condition to the polls. Not a single Southern legislator believed free Negro labor was possible without a system of restrictions that took all of its freedom away. There was scarcely a white man in the South who did not honestly regard emancipation as a crime and its practical nullification as a duty. In such a situation, the granting of the ballot to the black man was a necessity. At very least, a guilty nation could grant a wronged race, and the only method of compelling the South to accept the results of the war, thus Negro suffrage, ended a civil war by beginning a race feud. And some feel gratitude toward the race, thus sacrificed in its swaddling clothes on the altar of national integrity, and some felt and feel only indifference and contempt. Had political exigencies been less pressing, the opposition to government guardianship of Negroes less bitter, and the attachment to the slave system less strong, the social seer can well imagine a far better policy: a permanent Freedmen's Bureau with a national system of Negro schools, a carefully supervised employment of labor office, a system of impartial protection before the regular courts, and such institutions for social betterment as savings banks, land and building associations, and social settlements. All this vast expenditure of money and brains might have formed a great school of positive citizenship and solved in a way we have not yet solved the most perplexing and persistent of the Negro problems. That such an institution was unthinkable in 1870 was due in part to certain acts of the Freedmen's Bureau itself. It came to regard its work as merely temporary, a Negro suffrage as a final answer to all present perplexities. The political ambition of many of its agents and prodigies led it far afield into questionable activities until the South, nursing its own deep prejudices, came easily to ignore all the good deeds of the Bureau and hate its very name with perfect hatred. So the Freedmen's Bureau died, and its child was the 15th Amendment. The passing of a great human institution before its work is done, like the untimely passage of a single soul, but leaves the legacy of striving for other men. The legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau is the heavy heritage of this generation today, when new and vaster problems are destined to strain every fiber of the national mind and soul. Would it not be well to count this legacy honestly and carefully? For this much all men know. Despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro is not free. In the backwoods of the Gulf states, for miles and miles, he may not leave the plantation of his birth. In well nigh the whole rural South, the black farmers are peons, bound by law and custom to an economic slavery, from which the only escape is death or the penitentiary. In most cultivated sections and cities of the South, the Negroes are a segregated servile caste, with restricted rights and privileges. Before the courts, both in law and custom, they stand on a different and peculiar basis. Taxation without representation is the rule of their political life. And the result of all of this is, and in nature must have been, lawlessness and crime. That is the large legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau, and the work it did not do because it could not. I have seen a land right merry with the sun, where children sing and rolling hills lie like passioned women wanton with harvest. And there in the King's Highway sat and sits a figure veiled and bowed, by which the traveler's footsteps hasten as they go. On the tainted air broods fear. 3 centuries, thought has been raising and unveiling of that bowed human heart, and now behold a century new for the duty and the deed. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So those are the first 2 chapters of W.E. Du Bois' book, The Souls of Black Folk, which I highly recommend that you pick up a copy. You can listen to the audio version. There's a beautiful reading of it. Now, there's a lot said about the South in that. Remember, that was written in 1903. And in 1961, my father-in-law, Max, preached at the First Baptist Church in South Miami, Florida, a sermon against segregation. And it's beautiful. And he was beaten up for it. He was called a communist for preaching it. He was fired eventually, and there were crosses put in his yard and burned. I cannot read the whole thing to you because it's several pages long, but my brother-in-law, Scott Morris, has a podcast called Unapologetic. You can listen to it wherever podcasts are heard. And there is the entirety of the thing read. So you can go listen to that as well for, Black History Month. You can educate yourself. I do want to say this. It ends by saying, well, before I get to Max's thing, I'm going to read this. So in the last paragraph, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the King's Highway. And it's interesting because I was reading, I did a little study on race in the Bible, the Bible app, the U Bible app. And the first day was interesting, and it talked about the King's Highway. I'm going to read this to you. Pain that leads to prejudice. Anyone hurt by a member of a different ethnic or racial group is at risk for developing prejudice against all members of that group. Even slight offenses may be powerful at reinforced old biases. As the conflict between Israel and Edom shows, the king of Edom refused to open the King's Highway to Moses and his people, a hostile act that likely grew out of a prejudice with roots going back hundreds of years to a feud between 2 brothers, Jacob, the ancestor of Israel, and Esau, the ancestor of the Edomites. Jacob obtained Esau's birthright and cheated him out of their father's blessing. That's Genesis 27. Esau swore he would get even. It's Genesis 27:41. Years later, the brothers reconciled, but until this incident in Numbers 20, the Bible doesn't again mention Esau's descendants, the Edomites. Apparently, those descendants never forgot the wrongs that Jacob had committed against their ancestor. As the Israelites struggled to traverse the desert, the king of Edom perhaps saw an opportunity for payback, and refusing Moses' request made life difficult for the Hebrews. Had Edom let Israel pass, the Israelites may have escaped their fiery serpents. Worse yet, the Edomites' action perpetuated hostility between the two ethnic groups. Even though God commanded his people to not abhor the Edomite, the Israelites did not stop nursing their hurt feelings. Later, Saul harassed the Edomites, David slaughtered thousands of Edomites, and turned their land into a military possession. David's general Joab then carried out a campaign of genocide against them. The cycle of hate continued for centuries. Even the baby Jesus felt its impact. King Herod, who ordered the slaughter of the infants of Bethlehem, was descended from the Edomites. Whatever our race or ethnic group, as Christ's followers, we're called to break the cycle of prejudice. We are offended and attacked by someone of another race. If we are offended or attacked by someone of another race or nationality, we gain nothing by amplifying our pain into general mistrust and hatred of an entire group of people. Rather than furthering stereotypes, we can reach out and seek better understanding, which is the point of Black History Month, to understand the history of it. More Christians aren't immune to racial and ethnic basis. Christ wants us to guard against prejudice, to keep it from compromising our integrity as his people. Now, back to my father-in-law. So he ends this beautiful sermon on, an argument for anti-segregation. And it's true, in the 60s, if you were an anti-segregist, there were people who thought you were a communist and you were trying to undermine democracy itself. It's so interesting. The history of the colored line in our country is amazing and deserves not just a month, but an entire year, because it's our history. It's not just Black history, it's American history. So this is my father-in-law, Pastor Max Morris. A preacher friend of mine was a pastor of a church in a Kentucky college town. 2 Negro boys from Africa enrolled in the college, being sent by Southern Baptist missionaries. One Sunday morning, 20 minutes before the worship service, the Negro boys walked into the auditorium and took a seat. One of the deacons ran to the pastor, protesting their presence. A hasty deacons meeting was called in the pastor's study. In spite of the pastor's advice to allow the Negro boys to remain, the deacons voted to ask them to leave. My pastor friend said, deeply disturbed, I looked out of the study window and saw those 2 boys walking slowly down the road. I could not help but believe that Jesus had left our church to walk by their sides. Proclaim to every people, tongue, and nation that God, in whom they live and move, is love. Tell how he stooped to save his lost creation and died on earth that man might live above. So, my friends, Black History Month is an amazing opportunity as it comes to a close to just recharge yourself in the human story. I'm going to read that last little poem again, because Christ was an example time and time again. The Samaritan woman, when he went and talked to that woman at the well, there were so many different things, racially, class, the fact that he was a man and she was a woman, she was alone, she was a divorcee, and he talked with her, and he gave her water, and he showed her love. And our jobs as human beings are to love each other. Doesn't matter who that other person is and how you think about that other person. You gotta love people. And if you do feel better than, the idea of racism or the idea of classism, the idea of thinking someone less than yourself, if you've ever been in a situation where you've looked at another person and thought yourself better, and I think as Americans and as a globe, that's the next step. What's going on right now in Russia and in the Ukraine. When anyone forces another group of people into submission, we feel it in our bones. It's wrong. Proclaim to every people, tongue, and nation that God, in whom they live and move, is love. Tell how he stooped to save his lost creation and died on earth that men might live above. Guys, I'm going to let you go with that. And I really appreciate you sticking through with me. There's so many of you that stuck with me through the whole reading, which I'm so grateful for. And this lives on. You can listen to it. Please go to the YouTube channel and subscribe today. That's an amazing way to hear the Chautauqua, not just live here on Instagram, but you can share this with people who aren't on Instagram. I think you can play the videos fast so it'll speed through a little quicker. I'm going to sign off. I'm so grateful for everybody. Last week, my birthday was a little darkened and dampened by loss, but you guys were so gracious to me, and you raised close to $9,000 for Her Hearts in Action, which is an amazing thing. You guys are unbelievably generous, and I couldn't thank you more. You guys enjoy the rest of February. Enjoy the rest of Black History Month. You can go on the computer and look up what the Crown Act is. I encourage you guys to go look up the Crown Act. I would encourage you guys to read books like So You Want to Talk About Race, or James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, or pick up W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk. Listen to it if you want to read it, because the history in there is amazing. And what you realize is that things that took place, what we think is ancient ago, it's really just our great-great-grandparents were born into a world where people were owning other people and treating them like property. And there is a racial, spiritual bondage that we have to break through. We have to free ourselves from that. And conversation and education and enlightenment, really just knowing about each other's stories. And that's what we've been doing here on the Chautauqua, is telling stories. So with that, happy Black History Month. I hope you round out February with a little bit of education. I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye-bye. Just checking out your comments here. Oh, and I want to stress this out. This is like the post credits in the movies. Max Morris was from Dothan, Alabama. He was a Southern man. So if you're from the South and you heard me talking about the issues of the South in W.E. Du Bois' book, and you were like, wait a minute, not all Southerners were like that, you're 100% right. Max Morris would have been 91, 92 years old this year, was born in Dothan, Alabama. And in 1961, he wrote this beautiful sermon, which, again, I encourage you to go listen to it on podcast. Scott M. Morris, Unapologetic. Go listen to that. Go look up the Crown Act and get busy learning. All right, bye-bye, guys.